Sparkly Beans. I wanted to do a little video about archetypes and how I use them in my spiritual practice and kind of how they relate to my general development. If you're new here, hi, my name is Avery and I help justice-aligned, neurodivergent, and nerdy humans to cultivate ease and self-trust for growing into our emerging future. And this video is going to be kind of a little bit unusual, but I've been wanting for a while to do more sort of general videos on this channel about my practice and about spirituality and philosophy, metaphysics, but I find that often when I think about these topics, it's just like there's so much there, and as a generator in the human design system, my strategy is to respond, and one of the things that I found really useful actually about that is realizing that when it feels like so nebulous and there's just like anything I could say, is that often when I just like come up with an idea and throw it out there, it will fall kind of flat or it feels kind of weird, like I'm preaching at you or what have you. But I realized that there was kind of a rich opportunity to use platforms like this and like my blog to actually respond to things that I am interested in that I would normally leave a comment about, because I have this habit of leaving really long comments in YouTube videos, on blogs and social media, and I think I was just realizing, gosh, how much like interesting stuff happens in these kind of like public spaces, but not spaces people are probably going to notice. So I want to try to remember when I can, when something like this comes up, to actually like just drop a video about it. I think that's like a cool way to use my responding strategy. So this one is actually I don't know if you would call it a VR because it's sort of a response to a comment, but I had commented on my friend Chimdi Ihezie's video. Chimdi did a live about finances and creative freedom. I think it was a few weeks ago-ish. I don't know what's the date on this video. I watch things so out of order, I never know. 3 weeks ago, yeah. So you can check out, I'll make sure to leave a link in the description below to Chimdi's channel. It's really excellent. She talks about her own spirituality, personal growth, healing, trauma. She's also a creative coach and has been doing this like Ask Chimdi series where she answers different questions and gives interesting advice. So really cool channel, definitely check it out below. But what this is a response to is that she made this video and talked in the video about a little bit about archetypes, and basically an experience that she was going through where a friend had explained it in the terms of archetypes, and how like one person in this situation had a really like strong, particularly strong archetype that they were feeding into, and how you know, that might be affecting their point of view. And so I had like commented and said like, oh my god, archetypes, that's actually like my whole spiritual practice is built on archetypes. And what Chimdi said was, quote, I would like put a little like cute little thing here, but I don't have the spoons to do that or figure it out. I don't edit videos, you know that if you've been here for a while, so I'm just gonna read it to you. Chimdi said, quote, my understanding, though not deep, is that they are to be transcended because they can repress emergent behavior in favor or commonly understood patterns embedded in our collective unconsciousness, sorry, end quote. So I thought it would be interesting to do like a little video and just respond to that, and particularly the idea of like, are archetypes something that we're trying to transcend, or like what does it mean to work with archetypes? So I will start by saying that I do think that there's probably like two different perspectives in that, the kind of like psychological perspective maybe of transcending archetypes. And I know Chimdi mentioned in the video, like Caroline, shoot, I always pronounce this wrong. It's Mace, I think, but I always think it's Miss, but it's Mace. And like I do think that there's like different contexts that you could take this in. So there may be folks, please feel free to leave a comment below if you're like, oh, I actually know the answer to this and I know like the different perspectives. I am not like particularly studied on archetypes, so I'll just say that to start. But what I wanted to do was actually talk about like my practice of working with archetypes and what I mean when I say that like, oh, my whole spirituality is based on archetypes. Because, you know, when Chimdi said like repressing emergent behavior, that was really interesting to me because, you know, I am an emergent strategist. I'm super into emergent strategy, and it is really important for me to like make space for what is emergent, so what is coming up. You know, in the little like tagline I always give at the beginning to introduce myself, and I say that I'm helping folks to cultivate ease and self-trust for growing into our emerging future. What I mean by that is I'm referencing emergent strategy there, the idea that the future is always unfolding actively in the present moment, and that it is emergent, meaning that like we don't know necessarily what's coming next, but also like what's coming next is not this far thing in the future. It's actually always happening. It is emerging like as we speak, as we interact with each other, as we act. And so, you know, obviously I would be very not into anything that might like block the potential of emergence. And so it just got me thinking about like when an archetype or a pattern or a story is useful and when it isn't. So when I say archetypes, I'm not necessarily referring to anyone's particular system or frame, although there are a lot of interesting ones. Caroline Myss is one of those. You know, if you're into Jungian psychology, I believe that Jung has archetypes. I have not studied Jung at all, so I will not comment on that. And there are other authors who have different systems of them. I really like to work with, if you're a deck person, I really like the Wild Unknown Archetypes deck. And in that deck, Kim Krantz says, like in the guidebook, you know, there are thousands of archetypes, like, and there are different ways that different, you know, cultures group them. And so like she just picked, I think there's 80, like that worked for this system. But you know, there's all different ways of thinking about archetypes. And well, yeah, so I'll just say that, like, that's the framing, is that I work with archetypes, not any particular system, but in and out of different systems I work with. So for example, I think the tarot cards, what are they? They're a deck of 78 archetypes, essentially. Astrology, like the signs, the energies of the signs are also archetypes. Any of these systems are personality types, archetypes, I would say. Because the idea of an archetype, if you're not familiar with this word, it's really just the ideas, I think Chimdi said, like our collective unconsciousness. There are these patterns that emerge, these kind of like, I can't, it's one of those words that's hard to define without using the word, but like, it's not like any one character or person or deity. An archetype is the kind of sum total of like a theme, and it's a personifying of that theme, like the hero, or like the reluctant hero is one I know of, or like the wounded warrior or whatever, that like pulls on something in our collective understanding. So some of the ways that I use archetypes, the first one is that I think of archetypes as kind of guardrails. What I mean by that is that they're a language that helps me to grasp concepts and then to like frame questions about my own experience, about how I want to show up, etc. They help take the kind of nebulousness of life and of spiritual practice and of spirituality, and they give me a language for thinking about it. I think that people who are drawn to metaphysical practices are probably very familiar with this, right? Like, you come to something like the tarot because it has a structure, or a lot of people do, because it has a structure. And even if you're more like an intuitive reader, like you might come to it because there's visuals, but like there's something to grasp onto, right? There's some specificity. Having an autistic brain especially, like it's really important for me to have something to grab onto. If I don't, it just becomes existential soup and I don't know how to engage with it. So that's the first thing I find really useful about archetypes, is that they provide a starting point. They provide something to like bounce off of, like a wall to bounce off of. And so even if, you know, I think Chimdi kind of referenced this like in talking about archetypes in her video, that they are often like kind of encompassing core values that somebody might have. And so you can look at an archetype and, you know, how do you react to that archetype? Does it feel good? Does it feel aspirational? Does it feel not so great? Are you actually like ashamed of that archetype, or are you like, oh God, I'm not that? In that way, I think they hold values and they tell us things about our values. And you might notice that, like, I've definitely, in 5 years or so of practice, like, I've noticed that over time, my reaction to like certain tarot cards, as an example, my reaction is very different in different years. Sometimes I'll pull something and be like, I don't want to confront that, right? And so that tells me something interesting. The second way I use archetypes is I think of them as a way of acknowledging imperfection, a way of going beyond a certain culture or a certain religion's belief. So when I use archetypes in spiritual practice, that can be as concrete as like a devotional practice almost to an archetype. I don't pray to a particular god or have an altar to a particular god or believe that a particular god is better than some other god or more real or what have you. But I use archetypes as a way to kind of tap into a particular flavor of divine energy that I want to work with. If I'm trying to bring and cultivate, this year, for example, I've been trying to bring and cultivate more love into my life, and the archetype of love and like compassion and love and like relationality, but also like self-love and all these things. And you could call those, for example, like, you can have a Venus practice. You can have a Venus, and that is basically what I have, right? I have like I've set up kind of a devotional space, a little altar by a window. That's like my Venus space. But even when I'm thinking of Venus, like I'm anytime I try to get too like hone in on a specific thing, then I start being like, well, I don't know, like I read this, here's like all the context of Rome and like Venus, and I don't agree with that, and like this isn't really me, and what about these other cultural practices? Well, and like I think sometimes folks approach this through a kind of like syncretic practice of like taking different pieces of religions. I think I'm very hesitant with that because not all those practices are open. A lot of deity concepts, right, are not meant to be separated, right? Like they're it's important that like they happen in practice, that in a lot of traditions, like you are initiated and you have a relationship, and like that is a particular deity. And so I don't do that, and I try to be really like mindful of that I'm not initiated in these traditions, and I don't have that context. And because I didn't grow up in a religion or a spiritual context, sometimes that is like a sense of, oh wow, like I guess I'm like missing this like feeling of connection. But my approach to it has been to instead work with archetypes, and when I do that, I'm clear that like I don't necessarily have a right to, let's say, I don't know, like work with like Aya, or work with like, what's another closed practice, like work with Krishna, or like a deity from a closed practice, or a practice that requires initiation. But I do think that there's inspiration from different practices, and I see that as like, oh, it's all part of this kind of archetype. And I don't want to like minimize the actual like gods or deities, but just to say that like I think you're gonna have a relationship with an archetype without having to like pledge to this one deity or like specifically work with this one deity. And one of the advantages of that is that sometimes I don't resonate with a particular, I'm both not in a particular context, and sometimes I don't resonate with things. So like an example with the tarot again is that when I realized like how deeply Kabbalah, and not Kabbalah like Jewish Kabbalah with a K, but like Hermetic Kabbalah, which is a very problematic tradition, anti-Semitic tradition, like the ways in which that's baked into all tarot that comes out of the Golden Dawn tradition, which is honestly most decks now and most tarot practice. At first it was like, oh fuck, well like, is the only right way to do this to like abandon tarot, or to just read Tarot de Marseille? Well, Tarot de Marseille is based in a culture that's also pretty fucked up, right? So we start going, well, everything's fucked up, so nothing's fucked up, like what do I do? And the way I've personally approached that is to say that, like, I can know, for example, that, like, the Golden Dawn tarot and astrology correspondences come from a really shitty context. And I can work with them as archetypal in the sense that, like, they're not the word, as it were, but they're a prompt or an invitation or, like, an interesting thing to bounce off of. That is not dogmatic. That is not, I'm not like, I believe in this, but it's just, let's engage with this idea and, like, how these two archetypes, this astrological and this tarot archetype, like, how they interact. Number 3 is that and one of my favorites, I think, is that I think of archetypes as kind of holding space for a lot of possibility and uncertainty and my own truth. So I mentioned that, like, the archetypes themselves kind of form that guardrail so that I'm even able to engage with any of this stuff. But I think they do a really good job of balancing between my sort of deep commitment to liminality and non-binariness and you know, nothing is certain, or there's no one truth, you know, that kind of thing. But that kind of thing is very hard to grasp in honest, like, spiritual practice, you know, like, to have any practice other than just existentially going, right? You kind of need some specificity. So I found that, like, ultimately this kind of archetype work, it really encourages me to ask questions of the archetype and then of myself. Like, to get curious about what are the different formulations of this archetype. Because even if we take something like, I don't know, the reluctant hero, I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of different traditions that have takes on that. And so even, like, this is sort of where, like, the comparative, like, understanding that, like, there are so many different, like, let's say, like, ocean divinity, right? Like, I'm very drawn to the ocean and, like, the archetype of an ocean deity of some kind. But all different cultures look at that differently and have different associations with, like, the ocean and different gods, or even you can look at, like, fiction. You know, I was really drawn to in the Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion, I was really drawn to oh my god, it's been so long. I'm like, am I gonna get this wrong? But yeah, Ulmo, right? Ulmo. I'm pretty sure Ulmo is the name in Tolkien, but, like, that's fictional, right? I'm very I relate a lot to, like, these natural archetypes, like tree energy or ocean energy or mountain energy, but, like, there's a lot of different, you know, cultural reference points for that. And then when you get to things like the archetype of justice or the archetype of truth or the archetype, right, you get really interesting questions about, like, what does that mean, and, like, what happens when archetypes go up against each other, which is really what happens when values go up against each other. And so, like, I get curious about all these, like, different formulations and, like, the ways that these archetypes, you know, come up in, whether it's characters, whether it's gods, whether it's whatever. Stories, I think, are really related to archetypes. And, you know, they give me a space to, like, play in the archetype, but not to be in devotion to any one creator or any one dogma, and to, like, really check in with my own intuition, and to always, like, you know, even something as like, kind of unproblematic as love. I'm not ever gonna be like, oh god, love, no. But, like, at the same time, it's like, well, what is loving? Ultimately, I'm coming back to my own intuition on that, even though there may be many different authors who could tell me something about love. And so I think, like, to what, you know, Chimdi was saying in her comment, like, I think I actually, like, really agree with the idea of, like, transcending. I'm like, I would think of that as, like, I think rigid stories can absolutely be limiting. And sometimes when we take the point of view of, like, a particular archetype and we really, like, identify with a particular archetype, that can really look like being, like, stuck in one pattern, and, you know, that can be problematic. So, like, you know, I've had issues before, right, with, like, kind of a martyr complex and, like, that side of Pisces. You can call it Pisces archetype, you can call it martyr archetype, but, like, I've definitely had the sort of, like, sacrifice, like, feeling like I should sacrifice, and that was what everything was about. And, like, doing everything from that point of view was actually limiting and harmful, to myself mostly, but probably to others as well. But what I like about working with archetypes is that actually working with a different archetype is a good way of having awareness of where you are stuck. And so, like in astrology, I love this, that it's like you can look at different sign energies and be like, okay, if I'm really stuck in like the martyr side of Pisces, how can, I mean, one, what are other like things about Pisces? And that's why, in that way, like Pisces is pretty broad to say, like, I don't know if a sign is really an archetype because it is a big energy and there's probably several archetypes contained within it. So it might be like turning from that martyr archetype to the healer archetype, to, you know, a different, or the sage archetype, or whatever, different things that might fall within Pisces. Or it could be looking to a different sign. Yeah, like, so I think in that way, I like working with archetypes because we can see like how do they mesh together and how do they associate with one another. And like, what are we, I don't think usually we're not trying to be any particular one archetype. I would totally agree with that. But I think we might be desiring to embody several archetypes, desiring to bring more archetypes in, or to balance the archetypes that we tap into differently. I mean, I love the way Chimdi also talked about, I think this is a Carolyn Mace thing, but talked about the idea of how, like, as we go through our lives, the different archetypes we encounter and like our sort of point of view archetypes change. And that's so true. Like, I think that definitely, and sometimes detrimentally, like I've definitely found that like if I'm really in a particular, like I want to be more this, I can go off the rails. So like even that martyr thing, it's like because I was really wanting to be maybe like the archetype would be like a healer, or like somebody really in integrity. I don't know what archetype that is, the saint or something. Like that is what pulled me into maybe the shadow side of the saint is the martyr, because I was filtering everything through integrity, and so I needed to pull in a little dose of like personal power or something else, something, or like forgiveness. Again, some of these aren't like, are they archetypes, are they values? I don't know, but like that's the idea. So I think I'm just always noticing relationships between the archetypes, and it's like an awareness practice of what is really strong with me, what is not strong with me, where do I want to work more. And related to this, I also just like, so it's like it holds space for like possibility, like what else could be true, where is an archetype like not fully serving me, or where does it need to be filled out a little bit more, what's possible, checking in with myself. It also, I think, encourages, you're working with archetypes as opposed to working with like maybe a specific deity, for me, encourages me to accept fallibility. And I'm realizing this is actually something that's pretty common in Northern European lineages. So it's really interesting because I am like full on Northern European. Like there's some variation, but like it's all Northern Europe somewhere, right? So there are different traditions in Norse and like I'm mostly English. And who the fuck knows? I mean, I don't really understand English traditions, but like, which is kind of funny because it isn't the majority of me, but where I come from. But like, if you look at like Norse, if you look at oh my god, brain, Welsh, which is another part of my lineage. Well, those are the main two I'm thinking of. But I think also like generally anywhere from like the British Isles and then Northern Europe, you get a lot of these like demigods, or like the gods are not seen as like omnipotent, omnipresent, all the omni words, that gods were seen as more related to the everyday and like more, you know, if you think of like the Norse myths, right, there's a lot of like partying and getting drunk, you know, like they're not perfect. I think that's an interesting thing to like tap into. And then related to that, the fourth and the final thing I'll say is that I like to work with the archetypes because I find them to be accessible and relatable. So again, like I do have a broader sense of like source or spirit or divine energy, right? I have a source of like a sense of like the oneness that we all come from. Like that is very present for me. I think for me, God is in the interaction and the relationship and like what falls in between the lines. My friend Jenna introduced me recently to this term, panentheism. And I'm like, oh yeah, I've been that since I was like 3. I just know there was a word, but like, which I'm not gonna try to explain now, but like, if you know what that means, that is me. So I have this sense of like something broader, but that is not necessarily like understandable directly with my human mind. So I can tap into that sense of oneness, but like I'm not going to be living every day in the like undifferentiated oneness of things, and that isn't my goal. I think it's good to tap into that. I think it's good to connect to that. I think it's good to always remember that that is there and to keep coming back to it. But I think that our experience as differentiated humans and why we're here is to experience the specifics, and is to like, you know, grasp things and is to like grasp things and then lose them, right? Like so much of life is death, and spiral and like and healing and going through like process, right? It's like it's very much not the destination, it's the journey. The journey is the destination. That's the quote. Journey is the destination has been like a really big thing for me this year. Being present to those specifics is what we're doing here. Is like why we have a self in the first place. And so even though like my belief system has a lot of liminality and a lot of like dialectics, like two things being true that like don't seem like they could both be true, and it's very non-binary, my brain is autistic. My brain needs order, and it needs categories, it needs specificity, it needs language. And so, you know, even if it's simple as something simple as like having an archetype that you can evaluate and say, this is not always true, it is useful for me to have that. And so in my human experience, my spiritual practice, and what I do when I mentor people, and this is something that folks have said I'm good at, so if you're interested, there's a booking link below. You can sign up for a spiritual mentoring session with me at any time. But one of the things folks have reflected back to me when I'm doing mentoring that shows up a lot is that I'm very much about like embedding the spiritual in the everyday, and that for me, like, I need to be able to grasp on to something specific that's happening, something I'm struggling with, a conversation I had, an experience I had, a thought I've been working with, and connect that to an archetype. Like, that's how spirituality shows up for me. And then noticing the repetition and noticing the pattern of how that keeps showing up, and then like where that feels off, and then like what I might want to change. And it works really well for me to have like a rotating cast of characters in the form of archetypes that I can reference and turn to. I imagine this is probably true of people who are polytheistic as well. Like it might be they're just like working with different gods and deities also works this way. But for me, it's archetypes. And so, yeah, that's the final thing, is that they're accessible and relatable. So just as a reminder, the four things that I said in this video. One is that archetypes act as guardrails. They act as like definition or language or categories to work with in a practical sense. Two, archetypes are a way of acknowledging imperfection and going beyond a specific culture, religion, or belief. Three, archetypes hold possibility, uncertainty, and then like just space for my own truth. And then four, archetypes as accessible and relatable. So ultimately, I would absolutely agree that with Chimdi that humans are way bigger than a single archetype, and that we go through different experiences with them over time. And maybe it is about transcendence in this way of like noticing where you're playing into one archetype or even one specific story and getting beyond that. And that's a big part of my practice. But also, I think that archetypes can be really supportive in helping us to see what emergence looks like, and helping us to actually quantify what's emerging and work with that, and ask, what do I want to work with? And even if we come up with the first answer and then we look into that and we find, oh, that's not it, well, great, that's something for us to like find an alternative to. And so like, it's kind of like how if you're trying to conceptualize space, you need to see lines to see what's in between. So the archetype is lines, and then I think like reality and truth is the space. So I hope this helps. Chimdi, if you're watching this, hope that was a good answer to like 30-minute answer you didn't expect to a random YouTube comment. But and I'd love to hear other folks. You know, what do you think about archetypes? Do you use them in your practice? How do like archetypes play in for you? Do you use them like spiritually, psychologically? You know, there's all different ways you could, and we've been talking about spirituality here, but that's my answer. And if you want more like practical, I'll try to think of practical ways to talk about archetypes. But that's it for now. So do check out the link below to Chimdi's channel. You can see what she's chatting about, and let me know if there are things you would like me to respond to. You can always leave a comment to any video, and if I feel called to do so, I will do a video in response. So cool. thank you all. I hope you're having a great, I was going to say what season it is, but you could be watching this at any time. So I hope you're having a great season, whatever season that is. And finally, queermagical.com. Check out my website. You can book with me, but you can also see lots of totally free content, blog posts, etc. And, you know, enjoy.